Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here. So I want to give an example of a real dilemma that a very, very poor city in my home county has. It's called South Bay. I'm just going to go through some things that I think we've already said, but to lead up to the story here. So Congress created the National Flood Insurance Program, as we've been talking about, NFIP, in 1968, in order to make flood insurance reasonably available to all property owners. And that we know that homeowners who live in a federally designated flood plan must obtain flood insurance in order to qualify for a federally backed mortgage. And I think also there are other mortgage, even private mortgage, in some cases requires that also. So in order for, and I know Honorable Carruthers, I think you mentioned this, in order for a community to participate in the NFIP, it must adopt FEMA's floodplain map and meet minimum standards and regulations to mitigate flood damage. The flood maps declare what land is within a 100-year floodplain. I want to emphasize that. So I guess meaning that areas which FEMA determines will flood once every 100 years, or has I guess a 1% chance of flooding every year for 100 years. Is that right? It's a 1%er. Okay. The participation in FIP and compliance with FEMA land use directives is technically voluntary, as we've heard. But local governments have little choice but to comply with the NFIP's participation, because residents need flood insurance, and there's virtually the private alternatives. Well, in Florida, or I don't even know if there's any. Is there anything in Florida these days?
Nothing significant that I
don't know. I know. I got
maybe surplus lines,
yeah,
possibly.
I got booted out of my flood insurance. All right. So now I want to just talk about the dilemma with South Bay. The new flood maps deem the city of South Bay, Florida, to be completely within a 100-year floodplain, requiring the residents of this city, which is one of the least advantaged cities in our state. I mean, we're talking about very, very, very poor. So it requires the purchase of costly insurance coverage from the NFIP. And now this is new. And the reason that FEMA has said that they're going to put South Bay in this is because of it is near Lake Okeechobee. Lake Okeechobee needs its levees strengthened, which is being done by the Army Corps, which is, I don't want to say anything bad about the Army Corps, but I'm just saying this has been sort of been dragging for a lot of years, all right? A lot of years. And now the Army Corps says it's going to complete the work on the Herbert Hoover Dike in 9 years. Okay, so here's my question, took a while to get to it. Oh, if it's a 1% chance each year for 100 years, and this is supposed to be resolved by the Army Corps, which has been taking too long, in 9 years, why does South Bay, where a third of them are living below the poverty line, have to pay the costly premiums now? Because they're not going to be at risk for 100 years. Okay, try to give that a shot if you can answer it.
Thank you, ma'am. So FEMA maps floodplains, and one of the areas that we do map associated with levees. And levees have to meet certain standards in order for FEMA to reflect the reduced risk behind levees. The Army Corps builds levees and then certifies levees, and then we update the map to show that reduced risk. Once the Army Corps gets through that process of constructing the levee and then certifying the levee to FEMA to certify that so that we can then remove that flood area behind the levee, and then the insurance requirements change based on that newly mapped zone.
Mr. Chairman, I just asked a few, yeah, thank you. I'm glad to hear that. How long will that process take?
After the
Yeah.
course certifies, I don't want to say that depends, but that depends. It can take some time. It can take up to a year or two. I can't give you a certain date. I'm not familiar with that particular situation. In some cases, when we have all of that data well ahead of time, hopefully that's occurring in this case, and I can certainly look into that for you to find out a little bit more about the case for your situation, though.
Well, I'm glad to know that it will eventually be alleviated, but I mean, it's not, you know, what can happen to a community, even in a period of 9 years, in a few years, where people can't get mortgages for houses, and you have a economically devastated area now. Can you imagine the devastation when people cannot buy homes anymore? I mean, it's a pretty bad situation, and the delay being caused not by anything that the people are doing or not doing, but the federal government in fixing a problem. So, you know, I just, I thank you for your answer, but I don't think the people in South Bay are going to be happy with it. And I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr.